The sun hung heavy in the sky, pressing down on the dry earth like a hot iron. Dust swirled in lazy circles around the few scattered huts that made up the village, kicked up by the occasional goat or barefoot child. In one of the smallest huts near the edge of the settlement where the land sloped down toward a dry riverbed, an old woman stirred a thin pot of water over a smoldering fire. Her hands, wrinkled and rough like tree bark, moved slowly but surely. She had long ago stopped counting her age in years. Time in this place was measured in rainy seasons, in harvest's mist, in the slow fading of strength. She lived alone now. Her husband had passed more than 20 years back, taken by a fever that came and went like a thief in the night. Her children had left years ago chasing work in the city, promising to send money, to visit, to bring her medicine. Sometimes they did. Often they didn't. Not out of cruelty. Life in the city was hard too, but distance and struggle had a way of stretching promises thin until they snapped. That morning, she had walked nearly 5 kilometers to the aid post at the edge of the next village. Her legs ached with every step, her sandals worn thin, but she went anyway. The food distribution happened only once a week, and if you weren't there early, there might be nothing left. She stood in line with other elders, their faces lined with the same quiet endurance, their eyes fixed on the ground or the horizon, never complaining. When her turn came, the young aid worker handed her a small cloth bundle, enough maize flour and beans for one proper meal, maybe 2 if stretched with wild greens. She held it close to her chest all the way home as if guarding something precious, and it was. In a place where hunger was a constant companion, not a visitor, a single meal meant dignity. It meant she wouldn't have to ask anyone for help that day. She imagined the smell of the beans simmering with a pinch of salt, the warmth spreading through her belly, the rare comfort of feeling full even for a little while. But on her way back, just past the crooked baobab tree that marked the halfway point, she saw something that made her stop. A young woman sat slumped against a rock, her head bowed, her body trembling. A baby no more than a few months old lay cradled in her arms, its face flushed and sweaty. The woman looked up with eyes full of exhaustion and fear. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. Anyone who'd lived long enough in this land could read the signs. Fever, dehydration, hunger. The old woman stood there for a long moment. The sun beat down. Flies buzzed around the baby's face. Her own stomach growled softly, reminding her of the meal waiting to be cooked. She thought of her walk home, of the fire she'd have to rebuild, of the quiet satisfaction of eating what she'd earned through patience and pain. Then, without a word, she stepped forward and unwrapped the cloth bundle. She held it out to the young mother. The woman stared at it, confused at first, then overwhelmed. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she reached out with shaking hands. She tried to speak, to thank her, but the old woman just shook her head gently and placed a hand on the baby's forehead. Warm, too warm. She knew that touch. She'd felt it on her own children long ago. Eat, she said simply. Feed the child. And that was all. She turned and walked the rest of the way home empty-handed. No anger, no regret, just the familiar weight of hunger settling back into her bones. When she reached her hut, she swept the dirt floor, fed the few chickens she kept, and lit a small fire. Instead of beans and maize, she boiled a handful of bitter leaves she'd gathered days before. The taste was sharp and unpleasant, but it filled the space in her stomach enough to keep her from feeling faint. She sat outside as the sun began to dip, watching the sky turn orange and purple, listening to the distant laughter of children returning from school. She didn't think much about what she'd done. To her, it wasn't heroic, it was just what you did. If you saw someone in need and you had something to give, you gave it. That was the way life worked in a place where everyone leaned on each other to survive. No grand speeches, no applause, just quiet acts of care passed from hand to hand like seeds. Later that evening, as she lay on her thin mat under a patched blanket, her stomach still growling softly, she heard the distant hum of a motorbike passing on the far road. She didn't pay it much mind. Motorbikes came and went, carrying messages, medicine, sometimes bad news. But that rider had seen something that afternoon. Something that would soon ripple far beyond the dusty path and the crooked baobab tree. The old woman drifted off to sleep, her dreams filled with the sound of rain on a tin roof and the smell of cooking beans. Real ones, not just memories. She didn't know it yet, but her small act of kindness had already begun to move through the world like a whisper on the wind, gathering strength, gathering people, gathering hope. And tomorrow the world would come knocking on her door, not with demands or questions, but with gratitude she never expected and generosity she never asked for. But for now, in the quiet dark, there was only the rhythm of her breath and the stars watching over the sleeping village, and that was enough. The next morning came in the same quiet way it always did. Soft light creeping over the hills, roosters crowing in the distance, the smell of wood smoke rising from early fires. The old woman woke before sunrise, her joints stiff from the cold night. She stretched slowly, wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, and stepped outside to check on her chickens. Life went on as it always had. She didn't expect anything different. She certainly didn't expect that the small thing she'd done the day before, giving away her only meal, was already traveling through the village like a ripple in still water. A few kilometers away, a young teacher sat at his small wooden desk sipping weak tea from a chipped cup. He'd been on his way back from visiting a sick relative when he'd seen it all. The old woman, bent with age, stopping to help a stranger with nothing but kindness in her hands. He hadn't said anything at the time. He hadn't wanted to intrude, but the image stayed with him. It played in his mind all night, clear and sharp, like a photograph he couldn't forget. Now, as his students filed into the one-room schoolhouse, dusty and wide-eyed, he looked at their faces and knew he had to share what he'd seen. Not to make anyone feel guilty, not to preach, but to remind them that goodness still existed even in hard times. So during the morning break, instead of the usual math review, he gathered the children under the big mango tree and told them a simple story. "Yesterday," he began, "I saw someone do something very quiet but very big. An old woman who has almost nothing gave her only food to a young mother and her sick baby. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't even say much. She just saw someone in need and helped." The children listened, their eyes wide. One boy raised his hand. "Did she know them?" "No," the teacher said. She'd never seen them before. Another girl asked, "Was she rich?" He smiled gently. "No, she's one of the poorest people in our area. She walks miles for food. She lives alone." But she still gave. A silence settled over the group. These were kids who knew hunger, who'd seen their parents go without so they could eat. They understood sacrifice. And in that moment, the story didn't feel distant or old. It felt real, like something they could do too. Later that day, one of the older students, a girl with bright eyes and a second-hand phone her uncle had given her, couldn't stop thinking about the story. During lunch, she typed a short message in her local language. "An old woman in our village gave her only food to a stranger yesterday. She has nothing but still gives everything." She added a photo she'd taken weeks ago of the old woman sitting outside her hut, weaving a basket, her face calm and kind. She didn't tag anyone famous. She just posted it to a local community group on social media, thinking maybe a few neighbors would see it. But the internet doesn't always move in straight lines. Within an hour, someone shared it. Then another. A nurse in the nearest town saw it and reposted it with the words, "This is the heart of our people." A radio host saw it and read it aloud on air during the midday show. A truck driver passing through the region heard it on his radio, pulled over and shared it with his family group chat. Soon the story wasn't just local. It was spreading across counties, carried by voices, texts, and posts from people who didn't even know the old woman's name, but felt moved by what she'd done. Meanwhile, back in the village, the old woman had no idea any of this was happening. She spent her day as usual, sweeping her yard, patching a hole in her roof with wet clay, boiling more bitter leaves for tea. She thought about the young mother and baby. She hoped they'd found help. She hoped the child's fever had broken. That was all. She didn't think of herself as special. To her, helping wasn't a choice. It was just how you lived when you knew what it felt like to be empty. But in the town 30 kilometers away, a young journalist heard the story on the radio while driving. Something about it stuck with her. Too often, the news was full of conflict, loss, and problems with no answers. But this was different. Quiet, human, real. She decided to look into it. She called the school teacher who confirmed what he'd seen. She spoke to the aid worker who remembered giving the food bundle to the old woman. She even tracked down the young mother, who was now staying with relatives in a nearby settlement. The mother, still weak but recovering, cried as she described how the old woman had appeared like an angel when she thought no one would stop. Armed with these details, the journalist wrote a short piece for her local paper's online site. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't add drama. She just told the truth. An elderly woman living in near isolation had given away her only meal to save a stranger's child. She included a respectful photo, just the old woman's hands holding a woven basket, not her face, to protect her privacy. The article went up that evening. By midnight, it had been shared over 5,000 times. People began commenting, "We need more like her. This is real courage. Can someone help her? She shouldn't have to go hungry after doing that." Donations started trickling in, not huge amounts, but enough. A shopkeeper offered sacks of maize. A clinic offered free checkups for elders. A small nonprofit that supported rural communities reached out, asking if they could visit. Still, none of this reached the old woman's ears. Her village had no internet, no television, no daily newspaper. The world outside moved fast, but her world moved with the sun and the seasons. She went to bed that night thinking only of tomorrow's chores and whether the clouds in the distance meant rain. But by dawn, things had changed. Early that morning, the schoolteacher received a call from the journalist. "We're coming," she said. "Not just me, others too. People want to help. They want to thank her." He felt a mix of excitement and worry. He knew the old woman. She was humble. She might be overwhelmed. He walked to her hut right away, his sandals kicking up dust. When she opened the door, he saw the same calm eyes he'd always known. "Something is happening," he said gently. "Because of what you did yesterday. People want to come, to help, to show you they care." She blinked, confused. "Why?" "I only gave food." "You gave more than food," he said. "You gave hope." She didn't understand it all, but she trusted him. So she nodded slowly, smoothed her dress, and stepped outside to wait, just as the first sound of engines echoed in the distance. Down the rough dirt road, far beyond the baobab tree, a line of vehicles was approaching. Dust rose behind them like a slow-moving cloud. Trucks, cars, even a white van with a red cross on the side. The old woman stood very still, her heart beating a little faster. She didn't know what was coming, but for the first time in years she wasn't alone in facing it. The sound of engines grew louder, rumbling through the quiet morning like distant thunder. Dust swirled in thick clouds behind the approaching vehicles, catching the early sun in golden streaks. The old woman stood barefoot in the dirt outside her hut, her shawl pulled tight around her thin shoulders. Her first thought wasn't of help or kindness, it was fear. In her long life, vehicles like these usually meant trouble. Government officials collecting fees, strangers asking for land, or worse, people bringing news of loss. She took a small step back, her eyes fixed on the road. But then she saw the schoolteacher walking toward her, his face calm, his hands open in reassurance. Behind him came the journalist she'd never met, dressed simply, holding a notebook but no camera pointed at her face. And behind them, more people than she'd seen gathered in one place in years. Men and women stepping out of trucks, some in uniforms, others in everyday clothes, all carrying bags, boxes, even rolled-up mats. No one shouted. No one demanded anything, they just came. One woman, older like her, with silver hair tied back neatly, walked forward slowly as if not to startle her. She held out a small basket covered with a clean cloth. "We heard what you did," she said softly, her voice warm like morning tea. "We came to thank you. And to help." The old woman didn't know what to say. She looked at the basket, then at the faces around her, kind, tired, hopeful faces. She saw the red cross on the van, the sacks of grain being unloaded, the young man carefully setting up a small solar panel on the ground. This wasn't trouble. This was something else entirely. Still, she hesitated. Pride ran deep in her bones. She'd survived droughts, buried loved ones, gone days without food, but she'd never asked for charity. Accepting help felt like admitting weakness. But then she remembered the baby's feverish eyes, the mother's trembling hands. If she could give when she had nothing, maybe she could receive when others offered with full hearts. She nodded slowly and stepped forward. What followed wasn't a spectacle. There were no speeches, no cameras flashing in her face. The visitors worked quietly, respectfully. A nurse gently asked if she'd let her check her blood pressure. A young man with a toolbox asked if her roof leaked when it rained. Someone else brought a pot of hot porridge. Real porridge, thick and sweet, and placed it in her hands without a word. She ate it slowly, the warmth spreading through her chest. It had been years since someone had cooked for her. As the morning passed, the space around her hut transformed. Sacks of maize, beans, and rice were stacked neatly under a tarp. A new jerrycan full of clean water stood by her door. Blankets, soap, candles, even a small radio wrapped in plastic, all placed where she could reach them. A woman from a local aid group sat with her on a low stool, explaining that they'd arranged for a doctor to visit every month, and that a small fund had been started to support elders in the village. Not just her, but others too. "You inspired people," the woman said gently. "Not because you're special, but because you reminded us what we all can be." The old woman looked around, her eyes filling with tears. She quickly blinked away. She wasn't used to being seen, truly seen. For so long, she'd been invisible, just another old woman fading into the dust. But today, people looked at her like she mattered. Not for what she owned, but for what she'd given. At one point, a young boy, maybe 10 years old, ran up holding a drawing. It showed an old woman under a tree, handing food to a mother and child with a big yellow sun shining above them. "I made this for you," he whispered, thrusting it into her hands before darting away. Embarrassed, she smoothed the paper carefully and placed it on the small shelf inside her hut, right next to her few precious things. A faded photo of her husband, a smooth stone her youngest child had given her decades ago, and now this drawing. By midday, the crowd had thinned. Most had left, promising to return with more supplies, with builders to fix her roof properly, with seeds for a small garden. The journalist stayed a little longer, not to interview, but just to sit with her in silence for a while. Before she left, she handed the old woman a small envelope. Inside was a note that read, "Your kindness fed more than one child." It fed hope. As the last vehicle disappeared down the dusty road, the village returned to its usual quiet. But something had shifted. The air felt lighter. The old woman stood in her yard looking at the pile of supplies, the new water can, the drawing on her shelf. She didn't feel rich, she didn't want to be, but she felt held, like the community near and far had wrapped her in a quiet embrace. She walked to her small fire pit and began preparing a real meal, beans and maize, just like the one she'd given away. But this time she cooked extra. Later, she'd take some to the neighbor who'd been sick and a little to the widow down the path. Because that's what you did. You shared what you had, especially when it came from kindness. And as the smell of cooking food filled the air, she smiled, not because of the gifts, but because somewhere out there, a baby was well, a mother was strong again, and people still believed in simple goodness. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. What started as one meal given away had become a seed, and seeds, once planted, have a way of growing into something much bigger than anyone expected. Days passed, and the dust settled, both on the road and in the old woman's heart. The sudden rush of visitors, the piles of supplies, the quiet murmurs of thank you from strangers. It all faded into memory like footprints washed away by a gentle rain. But the changes remained. Her hut felt sturdier now, not just because of the new roof beams and the tarp carefully stretched over the thatch, but because something inside her had shifted too. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was seen. Still, she kept to her routines. She rose with the sun, fed her chickens, swept her yard, and boiled her tea. But now when neighbors passed by, they stopped longer. They asked how she was. They brought her fresh greens from their gardens or a handful of ripe mangoes. Children waved shyly, some even leaving small drawings or handmade bracelets by her door. She never asked for any of it, but she accepted each gift with a nod and a soft thank you, tucking them away like treasures. One afternoon, as she sat weaving a basket from dried reeds, a woman from the next village came walking up the path. She carried a small bag and a tired smile. "I heard your story," she said, sitting beside her without waiting for an invitation. "My mother used to say, if you have one loaf, break it with the one who has none. I forgot that, until I heard about you." The old woman looked up from her weaving. "I didn't do anything special," she said quietly. "I just saw someone hungry." "But you gave when you had nothing yourself," the woman replied. "That's what makes it special." They sat in silence for a while, watching the chickens peck at the dirt. Then the woman reached into her bag and pulled out a small tin of ointment. "For your hands," she said. "My grandmother used this for her joints. It helps." The old woman accepted it, her fingers brushing the cool metal. She didn't say much, but her eyes softened. It wasn't the ointment she valued, it was the remembering. Someone had thought of her pain and brought relief without being asked. Word of her quiet generosity continued to spread, not through loud announcements but through stories told over evening fires, in market stalls and schoolyards. People began talking not just about her, but about the elders in their own villages. Those who lived alone, who went days without visitors, who ate one meal and called it enough. A local church group started a weekly food run for elderly residents. A youth club began visiting seniors to help with chores or just sit and listen to their stories. What had begun with one meal had sparked something much larger, a quiet movement of care. But with attention came moments of discomfort. One day a man arrived with a fancy camera, saying he wanted to make a short film about her. He spoke fast, used big words, and kept asking her to recreate the moment when she gave away her food. She refused. "That moment is gone," she told him firmly. It wasn't for show. It was real. He left disappointed, but she didn't regret it. She didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted to be herself, someone who helped when she could, who lived simply, who believed kindness didn't need an audience. Later that week, a reporter from a national radio station came, but this time, things were different. He didn't bring lights or microphones. He sat on the ground with her, shared a cup of tea, and simply asked, "What do you wish people understood about life here?" She thought for a long time before answering. "That we are not waiting to be saved," she said slowly. "We are already helping each other. We just need a little support sometimes, not pity." Her words were broadcast a few days later. Listeners called in from cities hundreds of miles away, moved by her honesty. Donations poured into the newly formed Elders Fund, not just money but seeds, tools, medicine. A retired nurse offered to volunteer monthly. A group of university students started a project to build simple rainwater catchers for elderly households. Through it all, the old woman stayed grounded. She never touched the money meant for the community. Instead, she made sure it went to those who needed it most. The blind man who couldn't fetch water, the widow with no family nearby, the old farmer whose hands could no longer hold a hoe. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in soft oranges and purples, a young couple arrived with their baby, the same baby she'd helped weeks before. The child was healthy now, laughing and reaching for leaves. The mother knelt before her, tears in her eyes. "Because of you," she whispered, "my child is alive." The old woman reached out and gently touched the baby's cheek. "Then we are both blessed," she said. That night she lay on her mat listening to the crickets and the distant bark of a dog. She thought about how strange life was, how giving away her last meal had brought back so much more than food. It had brought connection, purpose, dignity. She never wanted fame. She never asked for thanks. But in the quiet way she lived, in the way she treated every person, stranger or neighbor, with the same gentle respect, she had reminded an entire region of something they'd almost forgotten: that no act of kindness is ever too small, and no person is ever too old or too poor to make a difference. And though the world kept turning, with its noise and rush and endless demands in this small corner of the earth, something beautiful had taken root. Not because of grand gestures, but because one woman chose to share what little she had. She closed her eyes, her heart full not with pride but with peace. Tomorrow she would cook extra again, and she would keep sharing because that's who she was. And that was enough. Time moved like a slow river after that, steady, quiet, but always flowing forward. The old woman's hut no longer stood alone at the edge of the village like a forgotten thought. Now it sat at the heart of something new, not because of grand plans or loud promises, but because kindness, once planted, has a way of growing roots deep enough to hold a whole community together. The roof had been properly rebuilt with strong poles and thick thatch that kept the rain out. A small tank now caught rainwater from the gutter, so she didn't have to walk miles with a heavy jerry can on her head. Solar panels powered a single bulb inside and a small radio that played soft music in the evenings. But more than these things, what changed was the rhythm of her days. She was no longer just an old woman waiting out her years in silence. She had become a place people came to, not for answers but for peace. Children started visiting after school. At first they stood shyly at the edge of her yard, peeking through the fence. But she never shooed them away. Instead, she'd call them over, offer them roasted ground nuts or a slice of sweet potato, and ask about their day. Slowly, they began to stay longer. They helped her gather firewood, water the small garden that now grew near her door, or simply sat with her while she wove baskets. She told them stories, not fairy tales, but real ones, about droughts survived, harvests lost and found, how to read the sky before rain, how to soothe a crying baby with a lullaby passed down from her grandmother. One boy, small for his age with eyes too serious for a child, began coming every evening. He didn't talk much, but he listened. One day he brought her a folded piece of paper. "I wrote you a letter," he mumbled, handing it over before running off. Inside, in careful handwriting, he'd written, "You make me feel like I matter." She kept that letter in the same place as the drawing and the photo of her husband, right where she could see it every morning. Meanwhile, the ripple from her single act of giving had grown into a steady current. The Elders' Care Initiative, as people began calling it, was now active in 5 nearby villages. Young volunteers, some students, some just villagers with spare time, visited older residents weekly. They brought food, helped repair homes, read letters from distant children, or just sat and held a wrinkled hand. A local tailor started making warm blankets from donated fabric. A retired teacher began holding evening reading circles for elders who'd never learned to read. None of it was perfect. There were days when supplies ran low, when rain ruined a delivery, when someone fell ill and help was slow to come. But the spirit remained. People weren't waiting for outsiders to fix everything. They were helping each other. Just as the old woman had shown them, she never took credit. If anyone praised her, she'd simply say, "I only did what anyone would do." But those who knew better understood. It wasn't that anyone would do it. It was that she did it when no one was watching, when she had nothing to gain and everything to lose. One afternoon, during the short rainy season, a group of teenagers arrived with shovels and seeds. They'd come to help her start a proper kitchen garden. As they dug the soft earth, laughing and getting muddy, she watched from her stool, smiling. One girl looked up and asked, "Why do you always share your food even when you don't have much?" The old woman thought for a moment. "Because hunger shared is lighter," she said, "and fullness shared is sweeter." The girl nodded as if she understood something deeper than words. As the months passed, the garden flourished. Beans, spinach, onions, even a few tomatoes. She gave most of it away, keeping only enough for herself. But now others gave back too. Someone left a basket of eggs at her door. Another brought firewood. A neighbor's daughter, home from the city for a visit, taught her how to use the radio to listen to news and music. She still missed her children. She still felt the ache of loneliness sometimes, especially on cold nights. But it wasn't the same kind of loneliness as before. Before, it was the silence of being forgotten. Now, it was just the quiet that comes between visits. And she knew the voices would return. One evening, as she sat outside watching fireflies blink in the dusk, the schoolteacher came by with a small envelope. "This came for you," he said, handing it over. Inside was a letter from a woman in another part of the country who'd read about her story. She wrote, "You reminded me of my own grandmother. Because of you, I called my mother today for the first time in 2 years. Thank you for helping me remember what matters." The old woman folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others in her small wooden box, the one she kept under her sleeping mat. It wasn't filled with money or jewels, but with notes, drawings, pressed flowers, and messages from people whose lives had brushed against hers, however briefly. She never imagined any of this when she gave away her meal that hot afternoon. She hadn't done it for thanks, for change, for anything at all. She'd done it because it was right. And yet from that one quiet choice, a whole new kind of life had grown, not just for her, but for many. Now, when strangers passed through the village and asked, "Where does the kind old woman live?" people would point with pride, not because she was famous, but because she was proof that goodness still walks among us, in worn sandals, with tired hands and a heart that never closes. And every evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the village settled into its gentle hush, she would sit outside her door, a cup of warm tea in her hands, listening to the sounds of life around her, the laughter of children, the lowing of cows, the murmur of neighbors greeting each other. Sometimes someone would stop by just to say hello. Sometimes they'd stay for a meal. She'd always make enough to share because in the end, that's what life was about. Not how much you kept, but how much you gave. And in giving, you never really lose. You only plant seeds for a future you may never see, but others will. And that was more than enough. The story was never meant to end. Not really, because kindness, once set loose in the world, doesn't stop. It keeps moving, changing shape, finding new hands to carry it forward. And though the old woman's days grew quieter as the years passed, her presence lingered in ways no one could have predicted. She was older now, so old that her steps were slower, her voice softer, her hands trembling even when at rest, but her eyes still held that same quiet light, the kind that comes not from strength but from peace. She no longer walked to the aid post. She didn't need to. The community made sure of that. Every week, without fail, someone brought her food. Fresh, cooked, and always enough for two just in case a visitor came by. But something deeper had changed. The village itself had shifted. Where once elders sat alone in silence, now there were benches under the big mango tree where they gathered each afternoon. Young people brought them tea, listened to their stories, asked about old songs and forgotten recipes. A small shed near the school had been turned into a wisdom corner, where elders taught children how to weave, grind grain, or read the stars. It wasn't called that in any official way, just something the kids started saying, and it stuck. The old woman rarely went to the gatherings anymore. The walk was too far, but she didn't need to. The world came to her. One morning, a group of teenagers arrived, not with shovels or supplies, but with notebooks and curious eyes. They were part of a school project, people who shaped our village. They sat cross-legged in her yard, respectful and a little nervous. One asked, "What's the most important thing you've learned in your life?" She didn't answer right away. She watched a chicken peck at the dirt, then looked at the faces before her, young, hopeful, full of questions they didn't even know they were asking. "Patience," she said finally, "and trust. Not in big things, in small ones. A shared meal, a kind word, a hand held when someone is afraid. Those small things, they build the world." They wrote it down carefully. Later, one of them would quote her in a speech at a regional youth forum. Another would start a kindness journal in their class where students wrote down one good thing they saw each day. The old woman never knew any of this. She only knew she'd spoken from her heart, and that was enough. As the rainy season came and went again, the garden around her hut grew wilder, less planned, more alive. Beans climbed up sticks, pumpkins sprawled across the ground, and sunflowers turned their faces to the sky. She couldn't tend it all herself anymore, but neighbors took turns. A young mother she'd never met before now watered the plants every other day. In return, the old woman taught her how to dry leaves for tea that calmed a cough. They never spoke much, but their silence was full of understanding. One afternoon, a letter arrived, not by post, but carried by a traveler on foot. It was from a woman who lived near the city, someone who'd read about the old woman years ago. She wrote that she'd started a small fund in her name, not for herself, but to help elderly people in remote areas get basic medicine and warm blankets during the cold months. "You showed us that dignity isn't about having much," the letter said. "It's about being seen." The old woman held the paper in her hands for a long time. Then she folded it and placed it in her wooden box, the one now so full it barely closed. She didn't need to keep every note, but she kept the ones that reminded her people still cared, that the world hadn't forgotten the quiet ones. Her health began to fade slowly like a candle burning low. She slept more, spoke less. But even then, she never asked for more than she needed. When the local nurse came to check on her, she'd wave her hand and say, "Go see Mom and Jerry first, her cough is worse." She always thought of others, even when her own body was tired. One evening, as the sky turned pink and the air cooled, a group of children came to visit. They didn't bring anything, just themselves. They sat in a half circle around her stool and began to sing an old lullaby, the kind mothers used to hum while rocking their babies. Their voices were untrained but pure, rising into the twilight like smoke from a gentle fire. Tears slipped down the old woman's cheeks, but she was smiling. She closed her eyes and let the song wrap around her like a blanket. After they finished, one little girl leaned forward and whispered, "Will you tell us a story?" She opened her eyes. "Only a short one," she said. And she told them about a time long ago when the rains failed for 3 years, and the whole village shared one pot of porridge every night, everyone getting just a spoonful but no one going completely hungry. "We didn't have much," she said, "but we had each other. And that made us rich. The children listened, their faces serious. Then one boy asked, "Do you think we can be like that again?" She looked at them, really looked, and saw not just children, but the future. "You already are," she said softly. "You're here. You're singing. You're sharing your time." That's how it starts. Weeks later, on a calm morning with birds singing in the trees, the old woman didn't wake up. She passed quietly in her sleep, her hands folded over her chest, her face peaceful. There was no pain, no fear, just the gentle end of a long, well-lived life. The village mourned, but not with despair. They mourned with gratitude. Hundreds came to her funeral, not just from nearby villages, but from towns hours away. People she'd never met brought flowers, food, and letters. The young mother whose baby she'd saved years ago stood by the grave, holding her now-grown child's hand. The school teacher read a poem written by students. The teenagers who'd interviewed her placed a woven basket at the foot of her resting place, filled with beans, maize, and a single sunflower. But the real tribute came after. In the weeks that followed, something beautiful happened. Families began inviting elders to eat with them. Young people started adopt-a-grandparent visits. The local council approved funding to build a small community care center, to be called the House of Shared Meals, and every year, on the day she passed, the village held a quiet gathering, not with speeches, but with shared food, songs, and stories of kindness, big and small. Her hut still stands today, though no one lives in it. It's been turned into a small space where elders can rest during market days, or where children come to learn old crafts. On the wall inside, someone painted a simple phrase in bold letters, taken from something she once said, "If you have one loaf, break it with the one who has none." Tourists sometimes stop by, drawn by the story they heard online or on the radio, but the villagers don't treat it like a museum. They treat it like a promise, a reminder that the most powerful changes don't come from loud voices or grand plans, but from one person choosing to care when it costs them something. And though the old woman is gone, her spirit lives not in statues or headlines, but in the way a young boy shares his lunch with a classmate who forgot theirs, in the way a neighbor checks on an elderly woman after a storm, in the quiet understanding that no one should have to face hunger or loneliness alone. Because of her, an entire community learned that generosity isn't about how much you give, it's about giving when it matters most. And that lesson? It's still growing.